The moment the waitress placed the coffee in front of the stranger, 3 quiet words escaped her lips, and the man behind the disguise suddenly stopped breathing. He had entered his own bar wearing an old jacket, a cheap baseball cap, and a pair of glasses, hoping to discover what his employees really thought of customers when they believed the owner was nowhere around. But he never expected that a tired waitress with trembling hands would look directly into his eyes and say, "You look like him." Those 3 words would force him to confront a secret he had spent years running from. If you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Because sometimes, the person who looks like they have nothing to offer is carrying a story that could change your life. The bar was called the Blue Lantern, a stylish downtown establishment with polished wooden tables, warm golden lights, and expensive bottles displayed behind a long glass counter. To customers, it looked like a place where successful people came to celebrate. To its owner, Daniel Carter, it was supposed to be the symbol of everything he had built after years of struggle. At 38, Daniel was a millionaire and a respected businessman who owned several restaurants and bars across the city. Newspapers described him as disciplined, brilliant, and fiercely private. Nobody knew that beneath the tailored suits and expensive watches was a man who still remembered sleeping in a broken car when he was 21. Daniel had built his company from nothing, but success had changed him in ways he didn't like to admit. He trusted numbers more than people. He believed loyalty could be measured through performance reports, and he had become so obsessed with protecting his business that he rarely stopped to ask what his employees were actually going through. Recently, complaints had started reaching his office. Customers were leaving negative reviews. Staff turnover had increased. One anonymous message claimed that employees were afraid of management. Another said the workers were being treated like machines. Daniel didn't believe it. So one rainy Thursday evening, he decided to investigate personally. He arrived at the Blue Lantern wearing an old gray jacket, faded jeans, inexpensive shoes, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He looked nothing like the man whose photograph appeared in business magazines. Even the manager failed to recognize him when Daniel entered through the side door and quietly took a seat near the window. The place was busy. Glasses clinked, music played softly, and rain streaked the windows. Daniel watched everything carefully. He noticed a bartender rushing between customers. He noticed a manager complaining about slow service. He noticed employees exchanging exhausted looks whenever the manager turned away. Then he saw her. Her name tag read Emma. She looked about 26, though the tiredness around her eyes made her seem older. Her brown hair was tied into a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard black uniform. Unlike the other waitresses, she didn't move quickly because she was energetic. She moved quickly because she had no choice. She carried 3 plates in one hand, cleared 2 tables with the other, and still stopped to help an elderly customer find his medication after it slipped beneath a chair. Daniel watched her quietly. When she finally approached his table, she smiled politely and asked what he wanted. Daniel ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu. Emma disappeared behind the counter and returned a few minutes later. She placed the cup carefully in front of him, but before she walked away, she paused. Her eyes moved across his face. Daniel lowered his head slightly. Emma frowned. Then she whispered those 3 words. "You look like him." Daniel's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. For a moment, the noise of the entire bar seemed to disappear. He asked her who she meant, trying to keep his voice calm. Emma looked embarrassed and apologized, saying she had probably made a mistake. But there was something in her expression that told Daniel she wasn't simply talking about his appearance. She was remembering someone. Emma finally explained that the man Daniel resembled was her father. Her father had once worked for Daniel's company. That sentence immediately changed everything. Daniel leaned back, suddenly uncomfortable. He remembered the name, Thomas Reed. Thomas had been one of his earliest employees, a warehouse supervisor who had worked 12-hour shifts when Daniel's company was still small. Thomas had been loyal, hardworking, and always willing to help. Daniel remembered him as a quiet man who never complained. But Daniel also remembered something else. Thomas had disappeared from the company 3 years earlier. Daniel had assumed he had found another job. Emma told him the truth. Her father hadn't left because he wanted to. He had been fired. Daniel's heart sank. Emma explained that Thomas had been dismissed after a shipment went missing. Management blamed him because he had signed the inventory records. He insisted he hadn't stolen anything, but nobody listened. The company report stated that Thomas had been careless and dishonest. Daniel had signed the termination papers without meeting Thomas. At the time, Daniel had trusted his executives. Emma's voice trembled as she explained what happened afterward. Her father never recovered from losing his job. His reputation was ruined, his savings disappeared, and the family struggled to pay rent. He became depressed and eventually suffered a serious heart attack. Emma had started working at the Blue Lantern to support her mother and younger brother. Daniel stared at his coffee. He suddenly remembered the anonymous report that had appeared in his office 3 years earlier. He remembered being told that Thomas was responsible. He remembered signing the documents between 2 meetings because he had been too busy to investigate. For the first time in years, Daniel wondered whether he had made a terrible mistake. He asked Emma whether her father had ever spoken about the company after leaving. She smiled sadly. He always said the owner wasn't a bad man. He said the owner simply didn't know. Daniel felt something crack inside him. He wanted to tell her who he was. He wanted to apologize. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because there was something else he needed to know. He asked whether she believed her father had been innocent. Emma looked directly at him and said she had never doubted him for a second. Then she revealed that her father had kept a small notebook containing dates, shipment numbers, names, and details about the missing inventory. He had spent years trying to prove his innocence. But the notebook had disappeared after his hospitalization. Daniel felt cold despite the warmth of the bar. He thanked Emma and finished his coffee without tasting it. That night, he didn't sleep. He returned to his headquarters and demanded the old inventory records. His senior executives were confused by the sudden request, but Daniel insisted. For hours, he went through files from 3 years earlier. Then he found something strange. The missing shipment had been recorded as delivered. But the receiving signature belonged to an executive who was still working for Daniel. Daniel's stomach tightened. He ordered an internal investigation. Within 2 days, the truth began to surface. The inventory hadn't been stolen by Thomas. It had been diverted by 2 senior managers who had been selling company goods through another business. They had manipulated records and blamed Thomas because they knew Daniel rarely questioned their reports. Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the evidence. He realized that his obsession with business efficiency had allowed innocent people to suffer. And Emma's family had paid the price. He immediately went to the Blue Lantern again. This time, he didn't wear a disguise. When Emma saw him walking through the door, she froze. Her face turned pale. She understood immediately. The quiet stranger who had ordered cheap coffee was the owner of the entire bar. Daniel approached her slowly. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't blame his managers. He didn't hide behind paperwork. He simply admitted that he had failed her father. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. Daniel told her the investigation had proven Thomas innocent. The company would officially clear his name, compensate the family for the financial damage, and pay for all outstanding medical expenses. But Emma shook her head. She said money couldn't give her father back the years he had lost. Daniel knew she was right. So he made a different promise. He promised to change the company. He created an independent employee review system so no worker could ever again be dismissed based solely on an executive's accusation. He personally met with employees across his businesses. He established emergency assistance for workers facing financial crises. He required managers to listen before making judgments. But his most important decision was personal. He visited Thomas. The older man was sitting beside a window in a small apartment, thinner and weaker than Daniel remembered. When Daniel entered, Thomas immediately recognized him. Daniel stood silently for several seconds. Then he apologized. Not as a millionaire. Not as a company owner. As a man who had made a terrible mistake. Thomas listened quietly. Finally, he told Daniel that he had spent 3 years waiting for someone to believe him. Daniel told him he believed him now. Thomas smiled faintly and said that sometimes being believed came too late, but it was still better than never. Those words stayed with Daniel forever. Months passed. Thomas's name was officially cleared. His family received compensation, but Emma continued working because she wanted to. Daniel eventually offered her a management position, but she refused at first. She said she didn't want a promotion because she was connected to the owner. Daniel respected her decision. Instead, he offered her something better. Training. He paid for her business education and encouraged her to become a manager because he had seen how naturally she cared for people. A year later, Emma became the general manager of the Blue Lantern. The bar changed too. Employees smiled more. Customers noticed the difference. And Daniel changed with it. He still wore expensive suits and still ran a successful business, but he no longer believed success meant standing above people. He learned that real leadership meant standing beside them. One evening, Daniel returned to the Blue Lantern after closing time. Emma was wiping down the same table where he had once sat disguised as a stranger. She looked at him and smiled. Daniel remembered the 3 words that had changed his life. You look like him. But now he understood what she had really seen that night. She hadn't simply seen her father in his face. She had seen the possibility that the man who had once failed her family might still have a heart capable of changing. Daniel looked around the empty bar and realized that his greatest success wasn't the money in his accounts or the buildings carrying his name. It was the second chance he had learned to give. And sometimes, a second chance begins with something as small as a cup of coffee and 3 unexpected words. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch silently. Like the video, share it with someone who believes people can change, and subscribe to Kindness Corner for more stories about kindness, forgiveness, courage, and second chances. And before you leave, I have one special request. Comment "Everyone deserves a second chance" if you believe that one mistake should never define an entire life. Because you never truly know what someone is carrying behind their smile. You never know how one kind word might change their future. And you never know when the person sitting quietly across from you may be waiting for someone to finally believe their story. Sometimes, the greatest transformation doesn't begin with wealth, power, or success. Sometimes, it begins with listening.